Welcome everyone to the Weston Roundtable Lecture Series. The Weston Roundtable was made possible by a generous donation from UW-Madison alumnus Roy Weston. He graduated from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and was very committed to the principles of sustainability, science, policy, and problem solving that the Weston Roundtable aims to address. This is sponsored by a few different departments here on campus, including my home, the Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment, or SAGE, in the Nelson Institute. I'm Tracy Holloway, and I'm a professor at SAGE. It's also co-sponsored by the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, the UW-Madison Office of Sustainability, and today by the Wisconsin School of Business. The Weston Roundtable is also a one-credit class, so if you're in the class, we have the sign-up sheet here at the front, and all Weston Roundtables are recorded. I don't know if today's is. It is. Yes, okay, we've never been in this room before, but that makes a great archive of past speakers if you want to go back for today's or if you want to look at other topics. So I'm going to introduce the host of today's Weston Roundtable, Craig Thompson from the School of Business here, and he will introduce our visiting speaker. So thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Douglas B. Holt, who is here to give his talk, Branding Climate. I was tempted to say Doug's a man who needs no introduction and just kind of leave it at that, but I think the formality of the situation demands a little bit more than that. So as a little bit of background on Doug, he did his PhD at Northwestern University and has had somewhat of a peripatactic scholarly profile. He started his career at Penn State, in the Department of Marketing, matriculated over to the University of Illinois, where he studied, was in their media and cultural studies group. A few years after that, moved over to the Harvard Business School in the Department of Marketing, then went across the Atlantic to Oxford University, where he was the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing at Oxford University. And then after several years in that role, he sort of segued out of formal academic institutions and kind of moved into the realm of being a public intellectual / marketplace consultant. And in more recent years has kind of come back into the academic game where he has a partial appointment now at Southern Denmark University. So those are just the basic credential side of it. Doug, when he did his PhD at Northwestern, his chair was John Sherry, who had come into the field of marketing from anthropology. Now, what was interesting about Doug, rather than just kind of following his chair and going down an anthropological path, Doug started to do work that drew much more heavily from a sociological tradition, particularly the work of Jorge Simmel and Pierre Bourdieu. So started to kind of pioneer his own way. And early in his career, Doug did a lot of work reconceptualizing more conventional marketing concepts like consumer lifestyles from a sociological standpoint, and then also really doing some really interesting work kind of adapting and updating Pierre Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital to where it would fit and work more effectively in the context of contemporary consumer culture and in the sort of the dynamic nature of the postmodern marketplace. And what was interesting about that work is it not only had a major impact in the field of marketing, it also attracted attention and got a lot of traction within the field of sociology. And that kind of cross-fertilization where marketers do work that actually has impact on the base discipline of sociology is fairly rare in our field, and Doug is one of the few who's done that. When Doug matriculated over to Harvard Business School, his interest started to shift just a bit. And while he maintained his grounding in sociological theory, he started getting interesting in the domain of branding, which is a very big issue in the field of marketing. And again, bringing a sociological and culturally informed perspective to really radically reconceptualize the way in which branding worked, not only from the business side of it, but to understand the role of brands in popular culture and consumers' identities both individually and collectively. And he developed these ideas in a number of articles, academic articles, and two highly influential books. The first one was How Brands Become Icons, which was published in 2004, and then a more recent book co-authored with Doug Cameron called Cultural Strategy. Out of that work, and in more recent years, Doug has developed an interest in kind of looking at issues of sustainability and kind of bringing together his insights from the field of cultural branding to think about how the sustainability movement could gain greater traction in popular culture. And I believe that's the spirit of Doug's talk today. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Doug Holt. Thank you.
It's a great opportunity for me to really unveil for the first time kind of a near finished piece I've been working on for about 8 years, which is to figure out how to pass major climate policy in the United States. So if there ever was a marketing problem, a brand problem that's like almost uncrackable, that's been one of them for the last decade. So there's a lot of background information I could give you to start with, and a lot of sort of academic hooks that I'm working with here. But it's a lot of material that I'm going to take you through, and it's probably should be an hour and a half talk, and I'm going to try and condense it under an hour and a half. So I'm going to give you a very streamlined talk today, which presents how to think about climate branding. Through the lens that I've developed. In particular, I want to explain why we haven't been able to pass major climate policy in the United States over the last 20 or so years through the lens of kind of a brand strategy critique, and through that get to a new strategy, which we're going to be sort of unveiling publicly in the next couple of months. So let me just start taking you through it. I'm going to give a little bit of conceptual introduction at the beginning that I'm going to have to go through really quickly. It's not probably going to make a huge amount of, be super coherent, but the way I try to put together the presentation is that as I go through the analysis, I think everything will become clear, and hopefully by the time we get to the end, it will strike home. All right, so I'm going to present the problem as given, and we can talk about this at the end, but for now I'll ask you to accept my sort of consensus view of where the science is today. We need to halt climate change. We have almost no time left to do it. To stabilize climate, we need to limit CO2 concentrations to less than 450 parts per million. A lot of scientific debate on whether that's way too high. My understanding is, well, we can't hit much lower. It'd be miraculous to hit 450 today. But what's really critical is then to come down to kind of pre-industrial levels very quickly within the matter 2, 3, 4 decades thereafter, else we hit these sort of positive feedback loops. The US is the most culpable in creating this problem. Historically, we built our modern industrial society on it, and we're still lead the league tables in emissions today by far on a per capita basis. Throughout the history of international climate governance negotiations, we've been the bottleneck more often than not, up through Copenhagen, up into the present. And it's really critical that we flip that around, that the US leads instead. So my focus is on domestic policy, not international, how to pass major climate policy in the US, which will turn the US emissions around, mitigate US emissions, and also be a huge motivation for China in the Paris COP talks coming up in December and so forth. So what are those targets? Again, taking sort of the rough consensus numbers, our sort of fair share of the global target. Back when I started working on this 5 years ago, we were talking about 2020, 30%, 35% reductions versus a 1990 baseline, which is what everybody uses back since the Rio Earth Summit. By 2020, we're in 2015, not likely. 40 to 50% by 2030, 90% kind of a post-carbon economy by 2050. By all projections, we have virtually no time left. This is still very probabilistic. If we hit these numbers now, we have 60, 70, 80% chance of avoiding these positive feedback loops with the albedo effect in the Arctic, with the acidification of the ocean, with permafrost, all the things you've read about, right? So this is where we are today. I just want to point this out because a lot of the Obama administration numbers are a little bit fictitious because we like to use the numbers that make us look the best. So they've, in the negotiations with China and in the Paris targets that have been promised recently, those numbers they base on 2005, which happens to be one of the highest levels of CO2 emissions that we've had, rather than 1990, which is the real baseline that everybody uses, versus the real baseline, this is 2012, we're still a little above where we were in 1990. We need to be 30, 40, 50% lower in a matter of 15 years and basically take out all those CO2 emissions and probably methane too in about 35 years. So what do we need to do? We need to rapidly convert from fossil fuels to renewables is the primary goal, and there's also a good argument that we need to focus intensively on industrial agriculture, livestock, and move to a sustainable agricultural system because of methane, and that the soil and forests are the main vehicle by which we're going to grab the carbon that's in the air and get back down to pre-industrial levels. So I'm going to focus on the first goal, but there's probably at least two that are crucial, which requires a very aggressive price on carbon dioxide and probably methane. It's not going to be accomplished by voluntary shifts towards sustainability by consumers or business. We've tried that for 25, 30 years. Not by utopian technological thinking. It's not going to be carbon sequestration from coal. Not by piecemeal industrial policies. Not by plotting economic revolutions. A lot of us academics like to do time to time. These have been ongoing for 30 years. Not that these things aren't important, but they're incremental. If we're really going to be able to hit these goals in the matter of years and a few decades, the one tool that we have that we know can be very effective if done right is putting a price on these externalities. Why have we failed to do this? This isn't new news. We've known this for, I think EDF and some of the other environmental NGOs were toying around with these ideas back in the late 80s. It was part of the Montreal Protocol back in the early 90s. These have been sort of the leading ideas for 20-some years. So we know kind of what to do. The problem is political. We've tried to pass climate policy since 1993. Back in 93, President Clinton tried to pass a BTU tax, complete disaster. Kyoto negotiations, Kyoto Protocol, 97 and beyond, another political disaster in the US. The Senate voted 95 to nothing against ratifying a treaty that would allow China out of the deal, and basically Clinton and Gore never even brought it up for vote. And then cap and trade, which I focused on extensively to kind of figure out what's wrong with the marketing of climate as a political policy issue, was another huge disaster, and I'll spend a lot of time going through that today. Since BTU, we've known that the only way to pass major climate policy is to generate massive public support for it. So the term a lot of people use for that is political will, which is just kind of a general, there's a lot of specific ways it works, but how citizens through democratic means can pressure elected officials to pass specific policy. And this is an incremental little policy. This is a huge tectonic, potentially multi-trillion-dollar policy. So this is going to require, it's not going to happen backstage through lobbying and technocrats. It has to happen through kind of popular democratic means, which means building a political movement, social movement, whatever you would like to call it, to make this a wedge issue, to mobilize people, to make this something that has to happen. We've tried to do that and we failed. Why? If you ask people in the climate movement, such as it is, they'll point to the Koch brothers and say, well, they're spinning evil lies, this whole climate skepticism, denialist industry that the big oil companies and some of the right-wing think tanks funded. It's true that they've done that, but I think that's not even close to the whole story, just provides another challenge for our marketing efforts. Gridlock in Washington, there is a lot of it. There's a lot of lobbyist money. It's a necessary, again, a necessary hurdle to get over. You need a political movement to bust through that gridlock, or you end up with the problems that Obama ran into with the healthcare bill. So that's what we're up against, but not an excuse for why we failed. The inconvenient truth, from my perspective, looking at this issue as a brand expert and studying it over the last 6 or 7 years, is that progressives are terrible, environmentalists are terrible at branding, really bad at marketing. And in fact, we've been outmarketed by what I'll call the carbon right. The carbon right, very well documented by sociologists, journalists, et cetera, is kind of a handy alliance of originally all the big fossil fuel interests. Jeremy Leggett called them the Carbon Club in a book he wrote back in the 90s, with right-wing interests, usually through right-wing think tanks, gathering together to keep the business-as-usual economy, the fossil fuel economy, going steady as she goes. And they, in fact, are very aggressive and I would say very smart marketers, and we're not. For the last decade, efforts to drive political will on climate change have been dominated by what I call the climate orthodoxy. I don't use that in a pejorative sense. I actually use very similar terms in my books on commercial branding. What you find in a lot of categories, big companies, they get involved in sort of groupthink. They kind of copy each other, very kind of common sense ideas of how to do strategy, how to go to market, and so forth. Innovation becomes very hard when you have a group of kind of a mature industry with big companies, and so there's lots of opportunities for innovation at the edges. In this kind of space where there isn't really a market for innovation, there's huge sort of groupthink going on around how you actually push through a climate policy based on growing political will amongst the American population. So I'll go through what that is in some detail. So what do I mean by the climate orthodoxy? It's all of our heroes of the climate movement, my heroes too, people I respect a lot and admire as writers and intellectuals and activists. Great at that, not so great at strategy. Al Gore, Tom Steyer, all of you have heard of Tom Steyer, is kind of the new kid on the block, so he's made all his money in private equity, a lot of it in natural gas and other such things, has seen the light and is now funding various political efforts in a major way. Came in with $50 million or so in the 2014 cycle. Are kind of the more mainstream representatives, and then kind of at the, let's say, the orthodox left, you have Bill McKibben and 350, and more recently Naomi Klein with her new book. But this goes back, a long way, and it's all the big green NGOs, the ones you all know, the NRDC, EDF, Sierra Club, 350, Rainforest Action, Greenpeace, on and on. All the big foundations that work in this space, Pew, Rockefeller Brothers, Merck, et cetera. Of late, these kind of digital movement organizations like Credo and Avaaz, the thought leaders are the ones we've mentioned, along with George Lakoff, who I'll mention again in a little bit. So the carbon right hasn't won because they just did this smoke and mirrors thing with the science. That's one thing they did, but that's just one arrow in their quiver. They actually instituted a very crafty cultural branding, counter-branding strategy since back in the early 90s that they've continued right to present day. And until we address this and actually do branding as well or hopefully better than them, we'll continue to fail at driving political will. So what do you mean by the carbon right? It's all the usual suspects that I'm sure you've come across. All the big oil, it used to be all the companies themselves. A number of them had to pull back about 10 or 12 years ago because the PR was so bad, the big international companies like the Shells and BPs. But you still have the coal companies are still in there, and there's a lot of industry associations that funnel money into these right-wing think tanks. You know them well here in in the heartland. Right-wing media supports it, and right-wing politicians get the money and speak against climate policy. Okay, so where are we today? It's been this whole conversation, the brand piece of it, the political will thing, starts in about 1988 when James Hansen presented the first kind of really credible findings on global warming, as it was called then, to Congress in a sweltering day. Became a huge cause celebrity. It's been talked about in technical circles for at least a decade more before, but then it became, it entered the media. The Earth became, the Times Man of the Year was the Earth and so forth. And quickly we moved into the Rio Earth Summit in '92. And so from about, let's say from 1992 onward, we've been, as a country and internationally, tried to do something serious and significant about carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, so that's 23 years. And so what have we done? So where are we today? We have no serious bill even on the table. There's two that have been proposed, but none have seen the light of day. They're very incremental, and even those are considered way too radical. No chance of passage. Obama has proposed for the Paris COP meetings, this big meeting that's coming up in December that we've all heard about. Our commitment is less than 50% of what is needed, and it's voluntary. I mean, it's meaningless. It's the best from the Obama administration's viewpoint. It's the best they can do. It's all these, through these executive orders, what they're trying to do to control emissions for coal plants and so forth. So far, Hillary Clinton has sidestepped. She announced her platform yesterday, day before. John Podesta is suggesting climate's going to be an issue, or campaign advisor, but it's not, it hasn't appeared from her lips yet. What's really disappointing and frustrating is in this situation where there's just absolutely no evidence of any progress, and the timing is so dire that the climate orthodoxy, all the big environmental groups, and all the money is not focused at all on driving climate policy today. The climate orthodoxy, for reasons I'll explain, have walked away from trying to pass major climate legislation, particularly a price on carbon, explicitly because they think, not only they think it can't be done, but they think it will backfire, as it has in the past. What I believe, after working on this issue for a while, from a brand perspective, is that it won't work if we continue with the same strategy, but if we embrace a better strategy, we can actually get this done and actually pass a much more aggressive carbon price than has ever been proposed. So I'll try and convince you of that over the next 45 minutes or so. All right, so to start with, I just want to give you a little bit of background. Again, kind of sort of framework pieces that I'm going to be using, but not spend too much time on it. Really spend most of the time taking you through a history of efforts to drive political will on climate through my lens, critiquing what's gone on in the past, and through doing that, building up the key components of what a strategy has to be for climate. Okay, so it's kind of two things at once: a critique and explaining why did cap and trade fail so miserably from a marketing perspective, and as I go through it, I'm going to be building up pieces of the strategy puzzle that we have to solve if we're going to do better. But first, let me just give you a little bit of background. So Craig mentioned some of the branding work I did, which I come more from a tradition, informed more by social movements and politics, thinking about these things culturally, cultural history. But I applied it, because I was in a business school and it seemed like the thing to do, to commercial brands. But my interest has really always been pushing it back into social and environmental issues. So I've done a lot of work with big companies over the years, the Cokes and BMWs and Microsofts and so forth. But I've really made an effort to do a lot of work branding social enterprise. Worked with Patagonia, REI, Ben & Jerry's as a client for a decade. We built the Freelancers Union, if any of you know that, Zipcar, et cetera, which has been really interesting work. But in the end, I think the real game is politics and social movements. It's where the kinds of ideas I'm working with can have the most impact. So I have this little pro bono piece of my business, which I call Planet Strategy, that's focused on doing that. So not just climate, it's, how do we rebrand the unions in the US and deal with right-to-work laws that you're facing here in Wisconsin, or global poverty from a branding standpoint. But right now, a lot of the work I'm doing is focusing on climate. All right, so this is just very, very quick and sketchy. So I'm just going to motor through this and get to the content of the analysis. So what do we mean when we say climate change is a brand? Branding is a term that gets thrown around all the time. You hear people in politics now talk about branding a lot, but let me just give you how I'm treating brand here. So something is a brand, or is interestingly understood as a brand, when there's shared public perceptions of it, of this good. In this case, it's the issue and the solution, and its value. So these issues become brands when they enter public culture, when they're set loose in the media, social media, word of mouth. That's when we start constructing culture around these issues. It's not technical, objective anymore. It's intersubjective, something we share and figure out as a collective and gets constructed in the media and everyday life. That's when it becomes a brand. So it's really when we're talking about citizens for issues that are often very complicated, both on the issue side and the policy side. There's maybe a tenth of 1% of people out there who really engage healthcare from the technical, wonky details that you need to really make a very wise analysis and decision about it. Same thing with climate, super technical on both the issue and policy side. As a result, you get these more kind of general heuristic understandings and value judgments and perceptions around climate and its solutions. That's the world of branding. That's what we are looking at when we're looking at Coca-Cola. It's no different for climate change. Works the same way. Crucial piece, I'm not going to get into the details of cultural branding that I've developed in I'm going to use it a bit here and there in the presentation, but I'm not going to explain conceptually, except to say that it's really important to think about these issues and their solutions and how citizens come to them, both from a kind of functional, what are my perceived interests, how does this relate, and from a identity standpoint. What does this mean to me personally? How does it fit with my way of thinking about the world, my ideology? How does it engage with my status? Okay, and that's a key piece that has been missing in the strategy that the Climate Orthodoxy has put together over the years. Another key kind of obvious piece from marketing, not so obvious when you look at how the climate movement has been built, is that these brands, for the brand for climate, can vary tremendously across different groups. And so we have to segment the market in kind of classic marketing sense. So the basic of thinking about brand strategy, we want to map the brand as it exists in society. So it's not we get to define it. This is what the issue is, because the climate scientists say so. This is what the policy is, because the economists and the public policy experts say this is the best policy. No, we have to go out into the world and see how people understand and value the issue and the policy across segments, such to the extent they exist. We need to determine brand goals by segment required to win, so we need to look at those segments carefully and think about how we can move them in terms of political will. As we establish those goals, we need to look carefully at what are the barriers and opportunities to advance political will for each of these segments. And then we're designing a brand strategy that really transforms the brand segment by segment and the whole thing. So it's just a very kind of straight sort of logical approach to build up from what exists out in the public today to drive political will. A couple of key points before we get into it. For issue brands, as opposed to Coca-Cola, let's say, the demand for a lot of commercial brands usually exists. In some industries, creating demand, like pharmaceuticals, a lot of it is constructing the demand for some ill or problem. But we don't usually think about that in a lot of detail. But when you're talking about political issues, the construction of the issue and the construction of the solution are two different pieces of the puzzle that you really need to disentangle. The sort of building on what I was talking about before, where identity is really important, political ideology as a source of identity becomes hugely important. So what you have happen in politics from a cultural standpoint is that you have people, that issues become key symbols to represent political ideology. I'm, a card-carrying member of the NRA versus the ACLU versus, that identity stands for something, being, for or against an issue. And sometimes it works the opposite. It's dialectic. Sometimes the issue drives the political identity. The way Nixon used busing back in the early 70s to kind of construct the forgotten, the invisible majority and so forth. But it's really critical to disentangle, to understand that political identity drives a lot of people's perceptions about the issue and the solutions. A lot of the work that the climate orthodoxy does forgets about that purple box above and just tries to drive home in a rational way what this issue is about, why you should care about it, forgetting entirely that how I think about the issue, whether I believe that the climate is changing, whether I believe it's human-caused, etc., has everything to do with the political ideology that I attach it to, and so forth. Okay? And then the last piece that's absolutely crucial that also is missing in the climate orthodoxy is that when you're talking about political issues where there's huge entrenched interests for the status quo, as there is here, you have intense counterbranding. So there's a brand effort and there's a counterbrand. And if you're not addressing the counterbranding, especially if it's effective, which it has been, you're sort of dead in the water from a strategy standpoint. Okay? So the way the analysis works for cultural analysis for branding from the framework that I've developed is I look at what I call brand genealogy. So I'm looking at the evolution of the brand and counterbrand branding over, since James Henson's speech, really, but really, since the BTU tax effort in Auburn, with a particular focus when things really got sort of hot and heavy from the Inconvenient Truth forward. So 2006 forward is where I pay a lot of attention. But really tracing this whole history, and we'll go through. And then when we get into sort of the present, really stretches back for me because I've been doing it since 2008. The last 6 years really drill down to different citizen segments. So lots of detailed ethnographic interview work to understand political ideology, how it maps into the climate brand. Okay, so this is the sort of the chapters of the story that I'll take you through right now for the genealogy part. The counterbrand era, from Rio to until really we engaged, Inconvenient Truth, until the cap and trade movement took off. A very brief cap and trade era, 3 years maybe, and then this partisan backlash era that we've been in since 2009, let's say. And then I'm going to go through segments. So when we get to segmenting the market across these people who have different political ideologies, different climate brands, these are the ones I'm going to come back to. So I'm going to call them climate concerns, symbolic greens, pocketbook populists, apathetics, Republican skeptics, hardcore denialists. So this is just, we're going to come back to this once we go through the history. Okay? All right, so the counterbrand era, again, long era. I call it the counterbrand era because from a brand perspective, a climate brand perspective, the environmental community was pretty silent for a long time. There's, occasionally, it's not just, we're not just looking at NGOs. There's, there's Hollywood, there's journalists, there's, the discourse is broader. But there was very little concerted effort until 2006. So it was really dominated by the counterbrand, the only game in town. Clinton, I'm going to go through this quickly. There's a lot of history here, but he proposed a BTU tax primarily for a deficit reduction, and it became BTU tax because of a lot of lobbying efforts by other fossil fuel industries. There was no effort at all to construct any popular support for this. The NGOs were still thinking very much like the effort to get rid of CFCs, that this could be a backstage technical negotiation with businesses, which turned out not to be. Dangerous analogies happen all the time in the climate movement. We're continually comparing it to civil rights, to slavery, to whatever, to World War II. This is another dangerous analogy. In strategy, each case it needs analysis unto itself. So this was an early dangerous analogy. Another one that was constructed back then is Americans will not pass a tax, so let's not tax people, which I think is another sort of dangerous, quick read assumption. So in place, so the right wing, this is building very much on the whole, I would call it political branding from a cultural perspective, building up from going back to the 1960s really, but certainly Nixon, Reagan onward of how did we become move the whole political spectrum to the right over the last 30, 40 years. Very, very effective political branding that's going on. And the way that it has worked always are through these issues that are really, in the discourse, very provocative issues that the right is able to use to push people's politics. And so when there's an issue that pops up, this carbon right, in this case, are very good at grabbing the issue and using it politically. So this became just, kind of low-hanging fruit for their branding. It's like, here's Clinton proposing this big tax, and it's actually a regressive tax. So the right-wing foundations got together and just, started hammering, talk radio. Back it was pre-internet, so direct mail and so forth. And then they repeated the same formula when the second IPCC report came, and the first really significant IPCC report came out in the build-up to the Kyoto talks. Same exact brand strategy, and it was never rebutted. So very, very successful in building this brand. What's happening on the environmental side? I mean, Al Gore and Bill McKibben wrote really nice books, but they weren't really strategically significant books. They were just they were good reading. As I said, there was just the NGOs didn't get together and weren't trying to push this issue. So if you're part of the kind of middle class environmental community, this whole area is very confused. Everybody's confusing. Is this global warming, greenhouse gases, ozone layers, pollution? All gets mixed into one. We've got environmental problems. And unfortunately, that's how, Al Gore's book combined these problems. A lot of the media combined these things together. So it really wasn't clear what we were talking about, except there's sort of a general feel that Earth's in trouble and I'm an environmentalist and I should care, but that's about as far as it went. So it wasn't surprising that when Gallup has done great polls for all this time, and climate change, global warming back then, very last on issue salience. Things I really care about and concerned about, want to move. 20 out of 20, 19 out of 19. Okay. So what is this counter-branding? Had a couple of components. The one everybody knows about, talks about, is the denialism, this denialist industry. A lot of great books have been written about it, journalism, so forth, where they're really attacking the climate science and attacking the media, too, for covering it in a biased way, which forced the media for a while to have balanced coverage and always interview a paid skeptic, which finally the media has been challenged on that in the last 5 years. But there was a decade or so when balanced coverage was the norm. But then there are these other pieces. So that's the issue. My argument is that was really pretty damning and important through the 90s and the first 15 years. Much less important today, but it's still what we obsess about. Much more important are these other pieces of the counterbrand, that this is a harmful tax on working families. They're going to Main Street and saying, look, they're trying to tax you, and who is they? It's the liberal elites trying to drive big government policies through. So it's the same kind of Reagan sort of rhetoric. It's a socialist agenda. And then there is this sort of macro argument, we're handing our economy over to China. So those are the key pieces. And the rhetoric's ultra consistent. They're on brand. You see it in the media, you see it in the right-wing think tanks, you see the politicians saying the same thing, everybody's saying the same thing, and they're trying to, they're basically telling conservatives, this is an issue that sort of reflects your, conservative bona fides, but also they're talking to Main Street, less political, and really getting them worried that there's a big tax coming their way. And so immediately pulls out. So the key piece of this, the cultural branding piece of this that I was talking about before, is that they're weaving this into this larger story about, it's this big right populist political construct, that there's this, we have to forge a populist revolt against corrupt big government, liberal elites who are ruining our country, stealing our freedom. So the myth might be something like this. Elite and corrupt politicos are at it again, stealing money and freedom, using the fake threat of climate catastrophe. So all this talk about it being a camouflage to get more big spending policies. They passed only to benefit them. Al Gore is trying to pass this because he's working in Silicon Valley and has a VC firm and is trying to make more money. Those kinds of stories over and over again. So therefore, the science must be questionable too. So the science gets wrapped in as a entailment of this myth. It's not, if you focus too much on the science, the story falls apart pretty fast. You just need, when you're talking about political myths, there has to be a grain of truth. There has to be enough so I can believe it if I want to believe it. So if there's a couple people saying, the science is wrong, and I don't look too carefully at it, and all the other pieces fit the way I want to believe, then I believe it. All right, so this is the way a lot of this, the problem with climate skepticism works. It's not because people actually believe the skeptics, it's because it fits this larger political myth. All right, so that era lasts a long time, unfortunately. And the thing with branding is brands get sedimented over time. They build up their culture, so they accrue. So this thing, this counterbrand is institutionalized without much challenge for about 15 years before we finally get to an era where there's some challenge. So it becomes a real issue. You have to address directly what has been built up to challenge climate policy. So 2005, 2006, finally climate change hits this political tipping point. So if you're reading the political science literature, they talk about in social movements, there's political opportunity structure. This is it. So it's this perfect storm of political opportunity. There's this huge bottom-up push from the cities and states who are so frustrated in the whole Bush era, no opportunity to do anything innovative on sustainability and climate. The IPCC 4 report was really definitive. The EU is making much more progress than we are and putting pressure on us. Bush becomes very unpopular in his second term. 2006 elections were a big loss. And then we have Hurricane Katrina, which people interpreted in the media as most likely exacerbated from climate change. So over this time, climate kind of lost its, there wasn't a deep sort of partisan pushback from the counterbrand. So there's some bills sort of sneaking around Congress. They were all ostensibly conservative bills at the time. They're cap and trade. So there's not really ammunition for the carbon right to come at these bills at the time. So they kind of built up from 2003 on. There's 4 different bills in committee. None of them are good enough. They're all sort of 30% or 50% of what we need, but it seemed even, John McCain had his name on a bill, which is today impossible to believe, that any Republican would have their name on any piece of climate legislation. So it was a kind of post-partisan moment, it seemed like. And big business came in, sort of saw this as this is inevitable and started coming in a big way. So there was this definite political opportunity, the tipping point of which was Al Gore's movie, which really had, if there's one thing that really did have a big effect over the last 20 years, it's this film. Huge, this blockbuster for a documentary, other than Michael Moore movies. I think this has done the best. But really had an impact specifically on middle-class environmentalist activists who really didn't understand climate change. It was a very muddy, confusing issue, and Al Gore explained it in a very compelling way. So people are like, I get it. I need to get engaged. And it also had this media tipping point effect, where all of a sudden the mass media, everybody's sort of getting on the bandwagon. So all of the mass media, magazines, journalists, cable channels start getting on board on top of Inconvenient Truth. So here's where it sort of seemed inevitable that, we're going to pass some climate policy. Let's make it a good one. And so you had this extraordinary thing happen where in the environmental community, most of the big environmental organizations tend to be very territorial, control issues, control lists. They don't always get along. They do good work a lot of times, but they're not so good at movement building because they're, controlling their own issues and lists. But it was different in 2006, 2007. There was this first integrated effort. Everybody got together and said, we're going to make this happen. The problem is they got together around the wrong strategy. And when I say wrong strategy, I mean deep down, the wrong theory, the wrong framework undergirding everything they did, which led to a lot of ineffective and even dysfunctional choices along the way. So I'm going to call it a mass sales model for those of you who've had marketing. In like the Marketing 101 textbook, we sort of, Phil Kotler mocks the sales, perspective, which is basically you build something and then you tell the salespeople to go sell it. And that's kind of what happened. We built something and then we tell, let's go, the NGOs and so forth, let's go sell it. It's a mass model in that it's treating citizens in an undifferentiated way. There are no segments. There are activists who are pushing, and then there's everybody else. Okay? So what we built was the climate change issue, best science, international politics, okay, 450, that's what we're going to shoot for. Climate change policy, we have some technical criteria, but they got put way on the back burner. It's really around political feasibility, these meetings that the Pew Foundation had with an NRDC and EDF with big companies, and let's figure out what's going to work for all of us. Sort of negotiated back room inside the Beltway. Okay, we've got our climate policy. Now let's go sell it, which is not a good way to do branding, as we'll find out. So we've got our citizens out there, the masses. We understand them in a very cursory, blunt way. The climate movement, like a lot of other politics, loves polls. Polls are really pretty miserable for really understanding sort of, strategic diagnosis. Very generic. Do you believe the issue? Is it salient? Do you support the policy? Can we move those? Those are our metrics. And so that doesn't get us very far. And how do we do it? We have protests, we get out the word, we try and get the media to cover it, convince you that this is really important. We have lots of messaging, different techniques to message the issue. Maybe we get Hollywood involved, do something more creative, and we try and convince the masses to really come on board this issue as we've defined it and this policy as we've defined it. So again, there was this big kind of collective effort, which was really unprecedented. Huge money involved. Al Gore raised $300 million. The alliance of all the big green organizations and foundations hired the best marketeers. They had really good creative, at the executional level, very professionally done. And then their secret strategy sauce was values framing, which continues today. I'm not going to go into a long discussion of that. Except to say, anybody heard of George Lakoff and framing? Okay. So even when you talk to anybody, 2004 electoral politics and environment for the last 10 years, it's, you just got to do framing. It's a framing issue. Get the frame right. Listen to George Lakoff. We got it. Actually, marketing has been doing framing for about 100 years. There's lots of, Lakoff is a structural linguistics expert, and he has a very kind of 40,000-foot view of framing. In marketing, it's often much more contextual and more culturally nuanced. And framing is one of 24 tools in the branding handbook. So it's not just framing, and framing is a very nuanced thing, and it's not. The Republicans represent the nurturant mother, and the Democrats represent the strict father, and end of story, as Lakoff tells it. So there's huge problems, because we're not sophisticated at marketing, having the guru come in and say, this is how you should do marketing, and people still believe that this is how we should do marketing, even though it hasn't worked so far in either electoral politics in 2004 or in the climate movement. So we selected this policy. It was called cap and trade. Nobody can explain cap and trade. So I've interviewed hundreds of people, and some people who are real wonky, enviro nerds, and you still, you would struggle to explain a ideal type cap and trade. The real policies, which were full of offsets and additionality and contingencies, and it was just, you'd expand these arrows and boxes by like times 10. Incredibly complex, huge new market. Controlled by Wall Street. This is 2007, subprime. This is, just thinking of it from a branding standpoint. I was over in Oxford at this point. I was like, why would you ever try? This can't be the policy. It's going to blow up. Nobody's going to understand it, and they're going to assume it's another boondoggle by the elites, and because it is. So, big problem. So, very quickly, sort of the marketing, the branding that went on. Gore and Company Alliance for Climate Protection started out with this Save Ourselves, SOS, very sort of clunky marketing, big digital organizing piece. People were very impressed by Move On. It had a lot of impact in the elections and in those days. So these kind of clicktivist digital petition idea. So they started there. They ran Live Earth, global concert to save the planet. 2 billion viewers, make climate famous and cool. They got rid of SOS, that didn't work so well, so they renamed the movement We Can Solve It, and the whole reframing was it was going to be post-partisan, and they had Newt and Nancy get together and make an ad together and say, hey, we both speakers, we don't always get along, but we'll do this together. Lots of, the Lakoff and the Breakthrough Institute said, oh, they came out with this paper, The Death of Environmentalism, and said the environmentalists are too negative and, stirring up, these huge catastrophic scenarios. Americans are optimists. Let's talk about the great things we're going to do. We're going to come together like World War II, like the Apollo Project, and we're going to rebuild the economy and do these great things for the country. So that was, probably 2 years of framing by the Alliance, plus a lot of Gore speeches at the time. Huge investments, and it wasn't just campaigning, mass media, but big investments in movements. Gore launched his whole, training all these people to do a slideshow. Big effort around this organization called One Sky. Tens and tens of millions to have organizers all over the country. Never gelled. 350.org launches at the time. Much more successful now as an organization. At the time, no traction at all. 6 people at a protest and showing photos of those protesters coming together. So that was, 350 kind of rebranded about 2011, 2012, which we'll talk about. The Carbon Right, meanwhile, all they did is reinvigorate that existing counterbrand. So it was already out there, very well developed. People, they knew how to think that way and already kind of thought that way. So let's dredge that up again. Oh, look, there's Gore and his elite friends again, and they were, it's Jeff Skoll, it's all these very wealthy folks, Hollywood, Harvard, all the places that, they like to make fun of the elites hanging out. Huge new government program heading towards socialism. It is a huge government program. Camouflage for a massive tax is going to hurt working families most. Again, no protection against that because, it's largely true, the way the cap and trade would work. Then there's ClimateGate, which we won't go into, which was another sort of blast at the integrity of climate science, even though the science was becoming spectacular by then. Let's go out and have another sort of cheap counterpunch shot against the climate science. So the result was nothing, no political will at all. There was the original papers I'd done on this, why isn't there no American climate movement at this time? And I got, lots of, critical rebuttals to that when I presented in a place like Boulder, because people like to believe that there is, but when you look at it in terms of effectiveness, we've yet to have one. A modest uptick around the whole media frenzy around climate, 2007, 2008, went away within a year. No change in the political will, no political pressure on politicians, remained very inconsequential, way down the list. No mobilization. So politicians who were kind of on the fence and they were kind of going with it because big business seemed to go with it and it's post-partisan, quickly backed away. Those who didn't lost their elections in 2010, if you're in Congress and running then, often because of this. So by 2009, the bill was dead in the water. Barely passed Congress, and the Senate, huge controversy. Obama pulls back, and it's gone. The other big problem here, and same thing that happened with Kyoto and BTU, is that it really sets up the way the branding worked, because they're not really paying attention to the brand and the counterbrand. It really sets up the counterbrand. It made a brilliant issue, sort of set the table politically to drive populist right politics one step further, was really a key plank in the Tea Party revolt in 2010, became this partisan wedge issue, where a lot of Congress, just like Congress, there are a number of Congress people who got BTU'd in 1994 on the back of the failed BTU tax. The same thing happened here. So didn't work and actually hurt. So what went wrong? So to get to I'm going to go through this extremely quickly because I want to get to the strategy that comes out the other side. But to get sort of the detailed answer, you can kind of start seeing some of the pieces coming together. But I go through each of these groups, and I spend a lot of time not just looking at the discourse, but interviewing people from each of these groups and figuring out where does the climate brand sit, why weren't they moved, what do we need to move them. So the first point here is that we can sort of get rid of, if we want to generate political will, we should just ignore the Republican skeptics and hardcore denialists, because they represent about 20-25% of the population. The climate orthodoxy obsesses about these folks and continually tries to rebut them. So we get rid of them and say, how can we, where are climate concerned, how can we mobilize them? They're already engaged. Symbolic Greens are engagement, not political. How can we politicize them? Pocketbook populist apathetics are kind of leaning to right populist politics, not very, not in a hard way, but are very worried financially. So this is the way the analysis goes, and I'll just take you through it really quickly and make the kind of general point for each. So apathetic populists, this is Main Street. These are people without college educations who have suffered mightily over the last 30 years, and in particular in the last 10 years, living paycheck to paycheck, one household problem, and you're bankrupt and so forth. The people Elizabeth Warren talks about a lot in her speeches. And if you're in this group, climate change is completely irrelevant. It's a foreign country. It's not about involvement. It's just not on the agenda. So forget it. What is on the agenda is what's going to affect me and my family, which is all about, if it's a harmful tax on working families, that's no good. They sort of lean right populists, big government elites that don't like them much. So that's what we have to address. Climate orthodoxy forgot about them entirely, so that's 40% of the population that we have to win, and we didn't even try to win them. Symbolic Greens, some people in this room might be included, generically sort of embrace environmentalism. It's very much a part, I'm a movement activist, it's not a core part of my identity, but it's part of middle class identity. If you're college educated, cosmopolitan person, you kind of support, environmental issues, you do the right thing. A lot of people say, I recycle, I take care of my community. The big problem here is what I call carbon consumerism. There's no idea that this is a political issue. The intuitive way to approach this in American culture, where consumer culture, is through individual consumption. So I have to do my part, hope my community does their part, and this is what got reinforced over and over again back in 2007, 2008. It was in Al Gore's movie, but that wasn't the worst part. All over the media, I did the launch strategy for Planet Green, which was a Discovery Channel that lasted about 2 years because nobody wanted to watch a channel about environment, sustainability. I was trying to make it a political channel. No, it was, here's how you downshift and live in this tiny house, and so it's all about consumption. So it's a huge problem politically when you believe that that's how we're going to solve this problem. It erases social movements, erases political movements. So that's Symbolic Greens. And then climate concerned, their real issue for 10% of people who are really, really engaged in climate, it's not an involvement problem. They're already on board and have been for a while. It's that there's no credible solution on the table to sign up for. So, I'd love to be part of something that I can see. I know that we have to hit 450 parts per million. I know we have to hit these amazing targets. So what is it? What's my role in it? So there's 10% of voters who could be huge wedge issue, very active voters joining up in the movement, but there's no place for them. So they're fatalists. I'm just going to do my local environmental stuff. I'm going to do the best for my household so I can tell my kids, I did the right thing. So these are the groups that I work with when I build out this strategy. So I'm not going to go. I'm going to skip this section. This section is basically looking at what happened in the last 4 or 5 years in the climate orthodoxy, which is more of the same. So despite the huge failure in the cap and trade era, no lessons learned because the logic, this kind of paradigm, hasn't been broken. So it's more trying to rationally convince people that climate change is real, which is really focusing on people we don't care about, denialists and skeptics, and keeping the issue in play. More Live Earth 2 is coming soon. And then this is really kind of important that what the kind of left orthodoxy does is gave up on climate change and started focusing on fracking and Keystone XL, ostensibly as this Trojan horse. Like we're going to get people involved and then sort of evolve them over. But what's happened is that it's taken over all the kind of cultural political oxygen has been focused on these symbolic issues for the last 3 years. There's been no uptick, no increase in focus on real climate policy. Lots of pseudo movements, more movies. James Cameron had a big series. We had a climate march that had no impact at all. Actually, political will went down 2 weeks after the march, despite, if you read emails from 350 claiming otherwise. Naomi Klein, if you think about these strategic issues that I've been talking through, Naomi Klein's trying to make this kind of a liberal left, economic transformation. This is about my immigrants and low wages, environmental justice. And here you have this socialist from Canada coming and telling Americans about this. I mean, this is a huge, talk about handing some branding material over to the carbon right. This is, forget Al Gore. I mean, this is, Naomi Klein, if she has impact, is going to be the next version. So give me a couple minutes to go through an alternative strategy, and then we'll open it up, okay? So we're just in the same place today. So how do we brand climate? So let me throw some ideas out, very different from what is being done today, and see what you think about this. So we have to abandon issue branding. We have to only focus on the solution. We have to debrand carbon consumerism. We have to focus on a single issue. It's not 100 things, but one. We have to make it very simple and intuitive and coherent, not cap and trade. We have to shut down the climate counterbrand, all these key components, the right populist piece, the tax on working families piece. I'm not going to talk about the activists today. For climate concern, we have to offer a really ambitious policy and a pathway to make it happen. So those are the key pieces. So I build up a strategy based on that, which looks something like this. So what's the brand concept? First, we have to think about the solution. So the solution that works really well from a brand standpoint is a massive, what some people call a fee and dividend, a tax and dividend. Why does it work so well? Because one, pricing is a conservative idea, so we can rebrand it to the right. Tax is very easy to explain. The $200 a ton works great because it's actually a policy that the models show will actually work. We'll hit our numbers. It's the only one that will. So the climate concern can come on board and become active participants. But even more important, it gives us the money to basically make this a really viable product for the Main Street, very, very financially challenged people in this country today, the pocketbook populist apathetics. So this has to be 100% refunded per capita, and all of a sudden you have this huge progressive shift from wealthy people have a huge footprint, to people who don't. And that becomes a really interesting piece to brand around. So the concept that I've been developing, I call it Planet Bank. It's not some acronym government program. It's a bank. It's very simple. It's not a tax. It doesn't look like a government policy. We have a really simple, everybody has a bank account. You see all the polluters getting taxed, money daily coming into my account, what is going to be deposited into my ATM account, or get through my ATM on a monthly basis. I can see I'm getting $40,000 over 10 years. This is real money all of a sudden. So this isn't anymore a big tax and spend government program. It's a nice, simple, interesting program that I can benefit from. So you can think of just making this, advertising it as a very simple idea, as one that you're going to actually get money for saving the planet. At a $200 a ton level, it's about $4,000 per person, per adult, gets refunded. So all of a sudden, a family of four, you're talking about $12,000, which if you're making $50,000 a year as a family is some pretty serious money. You want to address people who are bought into carbon consumerism. So you can think of a lot of ways to communicate this. Make money, save the planet. Vote for this, $6,000. We can flip the liberal elite piece around. All of a sudden, working people are the new environmentalists. Al Gore is the poster child of the liberal elite environmentalists. That's great. Let's use it that way. Cultural branding, we can flip it around and say, yes, Al Gore should pay really high taxes because he does fly around the planet. Real environmentalists, Main Street working people, are people who should actually get paid for being the real environmentalists and save the planet. So we're sort of reframing it in this, taking away the liberal elite piece, reframing it as the right populist piece. For upper middle class folks, we want to take away the escape route. I buy a Prius, I recycle, that's good enough. Actually, those aren't status symbols. If you're a real environmentalist, you need to favor a tax. So all of a sudden, we need to make a tax into the new green status and take away the idea that putting in LEDs and so forth is actually going to do the job. And then a big piece of it is just taking back the right populist piece from the right-wing think tanks. So what we're doing is we're freeing the market for the planet here, because this is a market-based policy. Adam Smith would approve. Ronald Reagan once approved of this. There's quotes, Sarah Palin once approved of carbon pricing, the Bushes, et cetera. So reminding people of this and challenging the right, say this is your policy we're using. So if you're really really a free marketer, believe in freedom, these are the kinds of policies we're going to use, and challenge the fossil fuel industry and the right wing for being not real free marketers. So that's the general idea. Sorry, went a little bit over. We're just building this up now. So I've got a team of really good political folks, creative folks, et cetera. We're going to really try and put this out in public in the next 2 or 3 months. If you're interested at all, we're just starting to build a site on Nation Builder. It's brandclimate.org. But I'll stop there, and maybe we have a few minutes for comments. Okay.